for joining us for Misty History, the Mists of Time, where Ritter, Brion of Bellatrix and I serve as your guides as we explore the origins of our principality. I'm Sara, currently Princess of the Mists, and today we welcome Duke Radnor and Mistress Hilary. Please tell us a little bit about yourselves.
Your Grace?
I'm Duke Radnor of Gildemar. I'm a Knight of the West. I was knighted in Common Era in 1979, and I've had the pleasure of reigning as king. And I'm as invested in the SCA as the SCA is invested in me, and so far I just cannot get away.
A fine investment, sir. Your Excellency?
Mistress Hilary of Sara. I joined the SCA in 1975 and started fighting in 1979, about when His Grace was getting knighted. And I was also very invested in the SCA for years, but I've drifted out for the last decade or so. 2020 was the year I was going to get active again, but we all lost 2020.
Indeed.
Well, let this be your start over day as we start heading into the end of 2021.
And thank you very much, the two of you, for joining us today. It's a real pleasure to see you both. I haven't seen you for a very long time, Mistress Hilary, and of course I've seen you more recently, Your Grace, but I do miss your face on a regular basis, my friend.
As I miss yours.
So let's go back in time, if we can turn our brain back to about 1977 and 1978. So this is the beginning of the Principality. So we love to kind of talk about the cultural shift that's happening in the West. So Caid left first, and then Tyr left. But where are we in the kingdom? What is going on culturally, and how are we moving into the later 70s into the Mists?
The area that is now called the Principality of the Mists basically regarded itself as the kingdom. The local groups were little social associations. They just didn't matter a lot to people. At one point, because you got the province of the Mists and the area around it. I remember there was one period where the person who was seneschal of the province of the Mists wanted to put somebody else on the job. And there was so little interest that an advertisement was posted in the page. The province of the Mists needs a seneschal. Submit resume consisting of name and address to the current seneschal.
Well, that sounds nice. I would love to look for jobs and just submit my name and address right now. That would be really easy.
Yeah, but people felt like the Mists was where it's at. The Mists is the kingdom. We don't need anything else.
Right, the entire concept of an assignation was hotly debated when I came over from Hawaii. And in fact, I remember there was, I don't know exactly where it was. I want to say Stanford, but I don't think it was. There was a tournament for the warlord of the Mists.
Mm-hmm.
And that was kind of a dry run for a principality lists. Right.
Do you remember how that came out?
Right. And
yeah, what was the outcome of that?
Well, that was Chris, and it was I was of the last three. Thank God my fighting hadn't gotten good enough. And it was a kind of a round robin between myself and Chris and Ellen Samaldana.
That'd be Christopher Houghton, I assume?
Yes, Christopher Houghton, right. And Christopher ended up winning that, but there was a lot of confusion as to what that role was.
Yeah, what did it mean, right?
But my understanding of it, my memory of it was that it was kind of a holding place. I think, Hilary, perhaps
I'm thinking about the next one.
Expectations, right? There's expectations that maybe it was going to happen when this was scheduled to happen, but things that occurred that pushed it out. And so it was kind of used as a dry run.
Because there was another tournament for Warlord of the Mists, or whatever they were going to call it. after that, I think,
Right.
because that one went to a three-way tie
Yes.
between William the Lucky and Stephen McInroog and Laurence or LaRoche.
Or that preceded this.
Was that the first one before that?
Yes, that's
Okay,
right.
That's the one I'm thinking about, because I knew it was the very beginning.
Right. Right.
But
May I ask how you get to a three-way tie?
Single elimination.
Well, you can do it with a double elimination as well. But yes, you come to the end of the day where you have three combatants still standing with the same records, usually all dirty. So you, at that point, depending on how the lists are run, the format they're in, you can either try to see who would be the best matchup considering who they fought previously in the day, how many losses they have, whether or not they've had a bye or not, or you could just enter the three of them into a three-way round robin, basically.
That would make sense. I believe that is what happened when Patrick won. Something very similar.
And if you remember too, the last Cornet I fought in, that was what happened as well with Ofer and Colin McClear.
And my knighting.
But what happened this time is not that.
Right.
Okay.
What happened this time, all of them had been out there fighting for people of their own.
Right.
And they all looked at each other, and it's the end of the day, and they don't give a damn about this anyway, when you come right down to it. So they looked
the
at
names
each other.
involved, I'm not surprised.
Yeah. Consider the people involved. And then I don't know what they said to their own ladies, but then they came over to me and they said, Hilary, would you like to be compromised?
That's right. I'd forgotten about that.
Yeah, well, it was much more vivid to me than to you.
So for the
So they
general
wound up-
viewing populace,
Yes,
I thought I would point something out here. In the early days of the SCA in the West, it was not a requirement to name your consort at the beginning of a tournament. And in fact, there have been a couple of cases where a victor of a royal tournament had decided to name their royal consort after the tournament was won. So that I thought I would. It's a foreign concept, I think, in the modern day of the SCA. But I thought I'd point that out since you kind of mentioned it.
Yeah, in at least one case, they hadn't bothered to warn the person whom they were naming.
Yes.
But in this case, so they wound up being the triple warlord of the mists. I was their communal lady, and I made for them favors. And one of them got the head of the salamander, and one of them got the central part of the salamander, and one of them got the tail, and they drew straws for them.
That is fantastic.
Which was the level of seriousness that we were all taking it. There was not a great upwelling of public opinion that says, we must be a principality. We don't need to be a principality, we're the kingdom.
Yeah.
Question for you. You mentioned the province of the mists, and while the province of the mists still exists, it's rather small. Back in the day, prior to the mists principality, what did the province encompass?
The Inner Bay area.
Okay.
Just as it does. I don't think its borders have changed.
Okay.
All right.
You go back to the very old literature of the society. The terms mists and west were used more or less interchangeably.
Right.
We talked about on the last recording that when you won Crown, you were called Prince of the Mists for a long while. So.
Oh yeah, as opposed to Crown Prince. Yeah.
Because it was
the only other province that I can think of that was really heavily active and had a lot of participants was Southern Shores during that time.
Yeah, Southern Shores was far enough out from the center that they were developing their own life.
Right.
The Marin County came in and out of activity.
God, it's Caldarium now. I'm not sure if it was Caldarium back then, Marin County.
No, it was beyond the rainbows for a while.
Right.
Caldarium.
And
it's Caldarium now.
It was not Land's End, but something weird.
That sounds about right. Yeah.
All right. So we have this tournament. The tournament happened. What happens next? Where do we go from there if it's everybody's kind of not taking it seriously, we're having a great time? Where does that, what's the next step? How do we get to where
Yeah,
we
how
are?
did that transition happen?
Okay, was the one your base was the one that you won? Was the one after that? And did you then preside over the formation of the Principality?
I was king when Christopher of Houghton and Esmeralda Dancing Star were prince and princess. Though I believe the actual formation of the Principality was my predecessor.
I think you're correct.
Yeah,
I'm not 100% sure there.
No, he's right. He's right. I have the dates. So it is.
Good thing you do, because none of us are have the great memory, it seems.
We talked about it a little bit too, because if you had fought and won that tournament, Christopher has mentioned that you had won the next one. You had won the next crown. So right. I remember that. And but yes,
so that would have made the king who presided over the creation of the Principality of the Mist Stein.
Yeah,
you are absolutely correct.
Right, yeah, that makes sense.
And now we have an idea for our next guest.
Oh, he's got some stories too, I'm sure.
Yes, he does.
Hilary, backing up a bit, this is where we have to take a breath. I'm pretty sure that the tournament that you talked about, the one that had the where you were the war mistress of all three warlords, came after the original Principality tournament. I think we already had a prince and princess when that warlord tournament was occurring. I think that happened after, because if I remember correctly, wasn't there a brouhaha with William and William the Lucky and Stephen McCanrug swapped great swords in the middle of a fight? You remember that?
I remember, yes, but that was later on. That was a real Prince of the Mist tournament.
Okay, that was one where Kevin Peregrine was prince.
Yeah, that was late. That was the one that I think William eventually won.
Okay, yeah, it's the right. That's right. I'm just looking for the appropriate amount of display of not taking it seriously as it relates to the stories at hand, and that's one of the things that came to mind. So I'm sorry.
There was still a lot of not taking of it seriously.
Yeah. Well, the early years, I mean, my early years were very much the forces of get over yourselves and how do we maintain a willing suspension of noble disbelief, where that continuum happened was, very much a big part of Brion's, early childhood, all that was happening then.
Yeah.
Now, as far as the timeline thing with the warlord, those two tournaments, the one where you were one of three, and then there was kind of the trial run one with myself, and then Chris Houghton and Alan Samuel-Donnick, where earlier, where I said yours had preceded that one. That's not the case. I was wrong. The one that you were talking about did happen after that kind of proto coronet, and they were calling it
right.
And I don't
because that proto coronet you're talking about with Chris, that was ostensibly him winning the first coronet, and he became prince out of that, if I remember correctly.
Is that right? There wasn't another tournament held?
I don't think so, because
okay, now that starts to make more sense. I was thinking about ultimate. I don't remember the actual coronet tournament that he won. So maybe I'm misremembering, but I think that makes sense.
And with him on as one of our previous guests, I remember him talking about sort of the ad hoc nature of the first coronet tournament, which wasn't even called that, I believe. But yes, there was that one you're talking about, and he did talk about the three-way finals and what have you. So I think what you're talking about really was ostensibly the first Miss Coronet.
Okay.
That makes sense.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. That's jives.
And then there was the whole thing about Chris fighting in Crown while he was
Yes.
still the first prince of the Mists.
Yep. And how did that work out?
Yeah, it wasn't against the rules, because I know William fought for the crown when he was prince.
Right.
And it was he was going to be stepping down before he would step up as king if he had won. So
That's right.
it wasn't until Jade pulled that same maneuver that the bod decided to say no more of that.
So one of the things that we talked about on the last episode was why the Mist was created, and DuPaul was very, very kind, and we talked a lot about the fact that it was more of an opportunity to reign. The Mist, or this entire area, is relatively large, right? It had gone all the way up Northern California through Oregon, all the way down to Southern California and whatnot. Very, very large area, and in fact, the Mists had the populace and the population to support a principality. Do you have anything else to add? Any interesting stories to tell about hearing anything from that time?
Not really. Do you, Your Grace?
My memory was that the creation of the Principality of the Mists was there was no mandate. It was in some ways just kind of it became a perception of progress somehow. There was this is manifest in our growth.
Kind of creating a greater depth to the organization.
Yeah.
It ties in with Sinagua wanting to be a principality.
Right.
Because if they're a principality, then what's everybody else?
Yeah, the Sinagua thing, the Sacramento versus Bay Area culture, regardless, is disparate to a sufficient degree that if someone were proud to be a Sacramento person, they would harbor, however fleeting a moment of discomfort of somebody identify. Oh yeah, Sacramento, right? Bay Area, right? So, and so there was enough of that going on that it kind of made sense. Sinagua, at the time, the Golden Rivers folks were kind of the Golden Rivers folks, and then the Mists, the Kingdom, were kind of the Kingdom folks. And so there was definitely they were just far enough away that when the Mists did it and became a principality, it was a fait accompli that Golden Rivers, the Sinagua group, would say, "Oh, okay, so you guys are a principality? Yeah, we're going to be a principality." Right.
I didn't really remember the timing of it. I know that there was one truly charming incident at, I think it was either a coronation, one of the big Mists events, where there was certainly royalty of Sinagua because there was a presentation to them of a roasted swan. Remember the roasted swan?
I remember that.
I don't, but it is very much in keeping with the lighthearted, rivalry between the principalities.
Yeah, this one had a neck that rose up where the bishop's nose usually goes.
Yeah.
Head.
So I remember when I was younger and just sort of becoming more aware of the the SCA as a whole, and it always seemed to me that and I know that after I grew up this wasn't really the case, but at the time it seemed to me that of the whole of a kingdom's lands, that it is all taken up by I didn't understand the marches, I should say, right? Mm-hmm. So from my perspective, it was like the kingdom existed and the lands of the kingdom were divided up, in total between the principalities that were, part of the kingdom. And so to me, that's, I kind of grew up thinking like, well, of course there's going to be the Mists, right? I didn't think of the concept that, well, yes, the kingdom is pretty much the Mists right now, in the time that it was created. So I think that's sort of what we're trying to drive at here is that what sort of if it wasn't like assumed that the principalities would take up all those lands, then why the mists, right? So,
Good question.
exactly. My father on the last episode was talking about how it was, again, another opportunity to have more royal tournaments in the kingdom, more opportunity for reigning. I think it kind of became over the years sort of like, to use a baseball analogy, the minor leagues, right? If you had an opportunity to come up without the pressure of a crown tournament or reigning on the kingdom level, and you're able to go out there and fight and one, get the time in and the experience, but also kind of prove yourself as well. It was a good, sort of proving ground for would-be knights as well. And that's been my perspective as an adult.
Yeah, I remember that, Brian. I do remember those conversations with, what's wrong with having, more responsibility? What's wrong with having, more examples of the model manifest at local levels, et cetera, et cetera.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It always kind of bugged me, though, that the marches stayed the marches and didn't have their own principalities be created, because to me, one of the advantages of principalities, and of course the mists falls out of this category because it is central to the kingdom, but one of the advantages to having principalities within a kingdom is to have sort of a more localized royalty presence in the outer parts of the kingdom, right? So in the early days of the East Kingdom, you had, Nordmark and Drachenwald. They're very far away from the center of the kingdom. It was an ability for the local areas to have their own royalty, and of course, they eventually became kingdom themselves there in Drachenwald. But I actually wish there were more principalities for that very reason.
Well, that's
where you get
the advantage of the Palatine barony.
That's exactly what I was going to point out. Palatine baronies do the same thing in areas where you don't have the density of people to support a principality.
Yeah, exactly. So then let me ask you a question, Hilary. You had the Cornet tournament that Mathan won, which, as I understand it, was not solely martial in its determination of the victor. What's give me your thoughts on that particular format and how you saw it at the time and how maybe you see it with a little bit of perspective now?
You really want to get Sir William on one of these to get the real background on how that worked. It was his idea. I went along with it and helped with it. But it wasn't something that I would have thought of on my own.
What
was it something, I know you said you went along with it and helped with it. Was it something that you, if the idea was brought up to you, would you have driven the bus? Would you have felt comfortable enough with that change in format to really be the driving force?
I thought it was an amusing idea, and I would never have thought of it.
Fair enough.
Having been thought of, it provided additional avenues of competition. I think everybody was quite relieved that the martial winner actually won.
What was the format for those of us who don't know?
There was, at the very least, there was an arts and sciences component to it. I don't know how that figured into the determination, but it was not just a martial tournament.
I see.
Yeah, it was the term sixfold lists comes to mind. There were a lot of different ways to gain victory points.
Yeah, didn't it act as kind of the early model for the poppy, the golden poppy?
Yeah. Let's get back into an old page and see how it was written up. I don't pretend to remember it in enough detail.
Okay, so let's backtrack back to the myths. So expanding, we're kind of talking about some of the stuff in the 80s. What was I love talking culturally too, because what's happening in the myths might not be what's happening in the West. So is there any major events happening? Is everybody in harmony? I like stories, so I like hearing we have a couple of master storytellers here, so I love hearing just some of this fun stuff. We don't always have an opportunity to sit down and talk with, especially two esteemed people like you guys. And this is a rare and unique. So just tell us all your stories about.
Yes, give it all to us.
Yes, we'll fall on that sword.
the stories that come to mind are not so much Misty history stories, because as you see where the mist was coming from. And one of my favorite stories is about Brion.
Well,
Let's
he's
hear it.
part of Misty history, so let's hear it.
They used to do night quests of various kinds and night fighting events. And there was one where we had the daimyo, who was out in the deeps of the woods, much defended, and he had people protecting him, and there were people creeping up to attack him, and there was just a pursuit of victory. And Brion and his brother, who were then possibly 8 and 10, I can't remember that night. You surely remember it.
That sounds about right.
But you went skipping off through the woods and talking to people and making a lot of noise in places where noise didn't need to be made, and saying how wonderful it was and how glad they were that everybody was playing and being so happy. And they went skipping into the campfire where the daimyo was, and they skipped up to him and they pulled out their little knives and they stabbed him to death.
God, I wish I remembered that.
Which was just the SCA in its essence.
But that sounds about right. I do remember the early days of my brother out there doing combat archery, and he would do things like hide in trees and find some sort of perched point to take advantage of a situation, much more than anything I've ever seen before ever since. So, I love that though. I do miss the quests and the abductions and things like that. The shtick that seems to have fallen to the wayside over the years.
Oh,
Well,
it would be good
everything's
to get
so
that back.
scheduled.
There was one of the abductions were all carefully prearranged.
Yes.
But there was one early on that I remember where
Say hi.
the several ladies were abducted, and remember Marshall of Eaglesbane? He went.
I remember the name, but I don't.
He was Strider Squire.
Okay,
tall,
that makes
blonde, beautiful young man went out ahead of the rescue party and got captured and thrown in with the abductees, because I've got a photograph somewhere of this pile of young ladies, all in garb, gowned, and arising out of the middle of the pile is Marshall of Eaglesbane's blonde head like a frog in a pond.
Love it.
Because they caught him and he was just left to be rescued with the others.
So speaking of shtick, and this is actually a Misty thing. I hate saying this, but when I reigned the first time, I was succeeding. Right, I don't have a drink, unfortunately. I was too quick to the table here, but I'll drink afterwards. How's that? I was succeeding Thorfinn the Cruel.
Uh-oh.
And he wanted to do a bit of shtick in the transition of the investiture ceremony, and so he decided to stage an assassination.
Oh no!
So it actually went off pretty well. He arranged for a friend of ours who used to live with us when I was still up in Sinagua last to be the would-be assassin. We had some fake blood stuff, arranged, a pseudo stage dagger to be used. And just as they're concluding their final court, this is Thorfinn and Kinswith, there are screams from the hall as a rogue comes dashing in and attacks the prince, and he's quickly taken away by the guardsmen and put into shackles and stuff like this. But there were some key people that we probably should have informed ahead of time. In this case, namely His Grace Duke Frederick Fleeg, and Fleeg lost it. Right, he was like it. You know how Fleeg gets. He's very passionate. He's very much into the moment. I would go to any sort of like performance with him, and he's drawn in, right? He has a hard time, I think, kind of delineating, what's really going on with, the play in front of him. And so he was sucked into this, and he was genuinely concerned that the Prince of the Mist was being hurt, like physically hurt. And he lunges forward. Somebody had to like hold him back. And even afterwards, he was quite upset about it too. And you know, we can laugh about it now. At the time, it was kind of like, oh, we should have addressed that.
Well, considering this unbroken line is a very well preserved.
Well, so the way that we made that happen is, you know, we quickly stopped court, their final court, and, you know, made the call to return to the hall for investiture ceremony in, you know, moments or what have you, while the prince is still alive yet wounded. So we open up investiture court, and here's Thorfinn with a giant bandage across his midsection with a big bloody section. He's kind of hunched over. He can barely hold himself up. Uther, his king, is kind of holding him up. And during the investiture ceremony, he just kind of one-handedly takes the coronet off and puts it on my head as he falls to the ground dead, right? So we managed to make the unbroken line still intact, but we had to come up with some stick about it. But my favorite part about the entire thing is, as you can imagine, Princess Kinswith was not exactly on board with this plan to begin with, right? So in order to convince her to make this happen, Thorfinn had to agree to lay in state in the hall for over an hour, as if he were a corpse. So we got a death shroud for him. He laid out. It was in some sort of community center in Milpitas, and so he was literally in the hallway outside of the investiture hall on this table under the shroud, and people kept coming by and wailing at his side. A couple people snipped a piece of his hair for reliquaries. Beck had cut a piece of the death shroud, which still hangs on his on one of his tunics. Right, it was a fantastic time. Messing with Thorfinn as much as humanly possible. I knew what the deal was.
Put it under his nose.
A couple people had done that too.
And he had to stop breathing.
Yeah.
And
it
so
was awesome. It was
longer and longer. He must be dead. We started taking it away. Wait, let's check.
So as much as I felt bad for those who were unduly surprised by the moment, I think the grand scope of that particular bit of shtick in the Principality went off pretty well.
What's nice is that it was a worthy exception, right? That what I like about the West is those flights are contained as exceptions that they earn their place.
Right.
They don't become the way things are done thereafter.
Yeah.
Do you remember when Helga stepped down? I wasn't there. I was back in New York. But when she was in her German and then she ripped off the skirt and she was in Lawns Connect pants after.
That's awesome. I know I missed that.
I did too.
I heard all about it. I'm sorry I missed that.
I do enjoy a good bit of shtick when it comes to coronations, especially. I love our ceremonies, and I love that, especially for those who are less experienced at reigning, that we have a ceremony book to help kind of guide people through these moments. But every once in a while is all it takes, in my opinion, somebody will decide to inject a little bit of theater into either a departure or their stepping up, and it's really quite wonderful.
They've been afforded the opportunity to do that by an otherwise structured progress, right? The fact that they can have those moments of dramatic levity is because it is, by contrast, dramatic levity, right? It's because not everybody decides that this is going to be their unique moment in the sun. Yeah. And that's part of the service thing, I think, that comes with you pursuing a royal authority, is recognizing and being second to the system and serving the system before you decided to come in and decide to change the system.
I'd always had this dream, if you will, of putting together a coronation, and the Rollins Lake site would have been perfect for this. And what I wanted to do was recreate a plate or two from the Triumph of Maximilian book of illustrations, where you had it was a massive parade. It was a triumph, right? So you had all the soldiers and the camp followers and the giant carts full of beasts gathered on campaign, the knights on horseback, escorting it in. And Rollins Lake would have been perfect for this because of the tournament field and the coronation field was on a rise above the rest of the event site. So you could hear the drums and you can hear the marching before you could see anybody rising up the hill, maybe the spear points or something like that, as the plate of the triumph, shows itself on the day of coronation.
Someday,
maybe. What's that?
I'll come. That sounds awesome.
Yeah. I like those moments, that raise the hair on the back of your neck. Those, as I like to call them, the medieval moments that we experience in this game. And I think that's really what makes the SCA stand apart from a typical reenactment group. It's cool to go out there and recreate the Battle of Hastings, right? It's cool to be out there and strictly, recreating 1480, in your thing, but with the SCA, since there's so much diversity and openness and really, freedom to express yourself in this group, these moments happen, and they are so inspiring, and they are the thing that brings me back every time I decide to take a break, step away. The people in those moments are what inspire me to return to the SCA.
Have either
I
of
have
you
a
had
photograph
moments?
of such a moment.
I'm sorry?
I have a photograph of such a moment from Pensick War, where everybody was allied with the middle, and the queen was dying for real. And the group comes over the hill. You've seen the armor of Henry VIII that's got a pleated skirt attached to it.
With the little door on it, yep.
And it looks so stupid in all of the museum pictures you've ever seen.
Right.
But the king of the middle had one, and he came walking out, and that skirt gathered all the light in the world and shone it from his face. And the whole thing is just heart-stopping moment.
Right. Absolutely. And you
That's
feel
what we
transported,
came back
didn't you?
for.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, we are the history that never was, but we get to make it so.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I love that the group, the SCA, the West Kingdom, and the Mists have all existed and been around long enough where we've now created our own history, right? Sure, we're not, looking back hundreds of years into the past or thousands of years even, but, 50, 40 some odd years, depending on the group we're talking about, is nothing to sneeze at. And certainly enough time for people to come and go and stories to come with them.
Well, it's lifetimes, and we are experiencing. Certainly, the three of us in this, Sara, you're recognizing it, but not having actually endured it. How things so quickly fade.
Right.
All these tears in the rain sort of thing, without getting too deep. But boy, it's the fact that a bunch of the stuff that, I'm looking at here, I remember those events, and I wasn't paying a whole lot of attention because we were too busy doing the SCA.
Right.
And to think back that, well, there's some significance there. That's relevant. That has some relationship to a progression of parts that make up a bigger whole. And I was, wasn't paying sufficient attention, and we're still alive,
right,
and having trouble making it all work in retrospect.
And coming from my perspective, until basically 1980, my memory of SCA participation is pretty spotty, right? In 1980, I was 7 years old, right?
Yeah, well, that's, Hilary and I, we were there through a lot of this stuff.
Yeah.
And, here we are kind of rehydrating, little desiccated artifacts. And it is kind of remarkable to think that this tells me that history really is essentially a collection of momentum that is sufficiently universally recognized.
Yeah.
And I've been after quite a few people this last year during COVID to talk to other people, to get it recorded. We're in a very unique situation where we have time, we have access, we have the technology. So we should be talking to as many people who have varying degrees of stories or whatnot to go back and remember before it's gone or
Right.
before that's we like to talk about how history is always told by the winner before it's only told by that one person.
Right.
So
Before the last person who remembers the days that Master Beverly poured his wastewater down a hole and a tarantula came out.
Right.
Or why King Douglas brown sleeves is the thing.
Right. With the privy.
Yep.
Okay, tell the story, please, because now I want to know.
What's the thing? Do you
What's
have
that?
anything talking about? I don't.
I may know where you live, so
Well, I feel unworthy of actually being the one to relate it. Were you there, Hilary?
I did not see the sleeve. I only heard the tale later.
Right. We were both. I think Hilary and I probably came in to the picture
Right after.
Yeah, you joined probably like right proximal to Douglas's first ring.
Yeah, that was the time that Douglas was stepping down and William of Houghton and Donna were stepping up.
You're talking about Douglas Longshanks, correct?
Douglas, yeah.
Douglas, yeah. So Douglas Longshanks, I think
They were on the thrones at that point.
Right.
12th night in 75.
Yeah, it'd probably be 77. So right about then. So Big Trees was where the West and by extension much of what the SCA kind of came out of was our communal experience in the experiment here in the Bay Area. It was the Big Trees, and it was a site up in the Oakwood Hills.
It's called Bort Meadows now.
Right. And there's great stories about that. What's a Bort?
I grew up there. That's my absolute favorite site. I almost literally grew up there.
Yeah.
Right? I probably spent more time at Big Trees than I did in my own home for a couple of years. Right.
Yeah, no, Big Trees was the Western tournament field.
Yeah.
And it was lovely. I mean, we took it so for granted at the time that you could just drive for 40 minutes and you might as well have been in Avalon. You couldn't.
Yeah, it was a meadows drop down from the nearest road, about a quarter mile down an access road, surrounded by hills and massive, trees, redwoods and oaks and just
eucalyptus.
Eucalyptus, right? Of course. It was also the nexus of about 4 major trails along the Oakland trail system. So it was in sort of like this little box canyon too. We'd still use it today if there was, I think, better options for parking. To be honest,
what killed us.
And then easy access.
Yeah, so Big Trees was the SCA for us, certainly in the first year, and the whole idea of the privy at the time they were made out of plywood.
Yeah,
it was before the fiberglass thing. Yeah, I bet they are.
Those plywood privies are still there.
And Douglas Longshanks had an Irish shirt. I'm not sure what you call those shirts, but
Lania, the long sleeve.
It's probably some syllable taken out of a word that means long sleeve in Gaelic.
Right.
And so that was his, and it was some bright color. Was it yellow? Yeah, some big bright, highly contrasting color.
Bright gold.
Yeah, and he had to break port to head into the privy, and so him coming back from the privy, those long sleeves had made it into the wrong portion of the privy.
And this is before they used the blue, privy fluid. So
yeah, this was damn medieval, is what it was.
Yes, it was.
And I really remember that whole Douglas Longsleeves thing because it was so real. It was so historic, right? You can imagine that if a person of note had befallen them under the best of circumstances, then that would be an appellation that would stick, right? And here we are, what, 40, 50, many years later. And it certainly comes to mind because a very, very good guy too, very nice guy. This is not meant to denigrate by association at all.
No, not at all.
As an artifact of, the way history plays out.
I think if he hadn't been a good guy, the story wouldn't have lasted so well.
Yeah, probably.
Yeah, very good point. That's right. Or it would have
You
turned
don't hear about Angus Brown sleeves.
Right.
Yeah, right. maybe as a Schadenfreude moment, but
anus, brown head or whatever. Yeah, it would be completely different.
yeah, that's not a name I've heard in a long time, thankfully.
So when you think about a lot of the myths, we're talking about names and people. Who all do you associate with? Like when you think about the history of the myths, who are some of these people? I mean, obviously to me, Christopher Houghton comes to mind being the first prince. Maven was the first seneschal. So are there any other names that you think are synonymous?
Well, I'd definitely say, in my perspective, Esmeralda for sure,
Esmeralda.
being Chris's first princess.
Although, of course, she would live in Golden Rivers.
Yeah.
Right.
But I don't think Sinagua was a principality yet.
No, that
Yeah.
can't be.
Yeah, it was a couple years afterwards.
Kevin Peregrine.
Mhm.
Right? Yeah,
Kevin-
for sure.
Kevin and Patrice.
It was
Yeah,
good to see. In the early years, the victors were, for the most part, they were kind of dedicated nobles of the knightly class. It was a means of being able to participate and contribute with the experience of the crown as prince, and kind of laying the groundwork for those who had not been king, then going on to take the position. So in the early years, it was lots of, you had people who had reigned as king and queen being prince, as opposed to, it kind of turned into like, as Brian said, kind of a farmly. So if you've already been king or queen, why would you want to be prince? It's a lot of work and a long time and all that. And at the beginning of the Principality, that wasn't the case.
No, there was, because that was just what everybody was doing today.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Quite the commitment that it is now. That was the idea. You went to a tournament, you fought in the tournament to win the tournament. And the burden of ruling was nothing at all, like it became very quickly in the 80s. There was a time when if you could reign, you reigned. I mean, when the question of can you reign wasn't can you afford a reign, it was are you in the club enough to come to all the events?
Because the only rule in the beginning was that you had to show up for your own coronation and for the selection and coronation of your successor. Everything else got.
That's actually still the minimum.
Yeah,
The
no, you have
minimum
the three because you have to be at your step down too. But that's it.
Yeah, that's she was including
the
that in
selection
that
and coronation.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Yep.
But yeah, that's still the current minimum standard for reigning.
Just three
But
events.
but the expectations got a little bit more extensive after that.
Absolutely.
When did that happen? Radnor, you said something about the 80s.
Yeah, I would say probably mid 80s, mid to late 80s is when it sort of stepped up its sort of social expectation of what the Principality royalty was to do.
Well, the royalty thing changed, right? The whole being king and queen stopped being, if you could win it, you won it. To do you want to win it? because the obligations, the keeping up with the Joneses started to happen. And
So what should be pointed out here, and I know that you both know this, but for our viewing audience, in the early days of the SCA, if you were a member of the Order of Chivalry, you were expected to fight in Crown Tournament. But then there, come mid 70s, my father and James, for example, traded back the crown several times over the course of 2 years, basically. And before, 1980 came around, both of them had reigned 6 or 7 times. And so that's when the notion of ducal prerogative came in that if you were a duke or duchess, you were not expected at that point to vie for the crown, right? You had the option to opt out of that expectation. So a lot of people misconstrue the notion of ducal prerogative, but that was its inception.
That was where it started.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was the idea of not entering crown because you didn't have the time was antithetical to participation at the lowest level.
Yeah.
Right. If you could win the tournament, we want you to be king, and all you got to do is show up. 2 more events, and it's all good.
Right.
Everybody wanted to do more than that.
So fast forward to basically the year 2000, and in my first reign, I actually did not have one weekend off. I went to an event every weekend, and often an event both days of the weekend, 2 different events on a weekend. I even went to 3 events on a weekend, 2 in one day, and then another on a Sunday. And while that may have been a little over the top from the norm, it was still in the realm of expectation for the royalty to just go out there and be a part of the local group experience. And I think that expectation was even higher for the Principality royalty than it was, say, for the Kingdom royalty, because in a lot of ways it was expected that the Principality royalty were the ones closer to the players in the local groups, right? They're the ones going to the events down in Darkwood or up in Caldarium or what have you, not necessarily in the center of the Principality, right, or the center of the Kingdom for that matter. So I think that expectation actually was even higher for the Principality royalty.
There was the growth phase. We went through, obviously gone through a number of them, but there was a big growth in the 80s, and talking about the royalty being attendant to that growth is what we're addressing here. Even before that, though, you have remember awards court. Remember when in the early 80s, the crown was getting enough presentations. In the late 70s, the idea of being able to present something, a gift to the crown, way to play the medieval role,
right,
and at the same time, kind of show off the stuff you can do and promote your area, and that was kind of that.
Local group taxes were another example.
Right, you're buying time in court by having a presentation for their majesty, and it very as the West seems to be. After just like 2 years, lots of traditions began to occur, right? Because they'd happened right in a row. And I remember in 81, 82, my second or third reign, courts were getting so long because of presentations. And they got long enough that the decision to start having presentation courts had to be made, where don't make a presentation during this court because we got business to take care of.
Right. So business court and fun court.
Which of course is just the beginning of the end because nobody wants to present
both of them.
Yeah, exactly.
Presenting. So yeah, that sort of thing was the growth of the group and the investment of that cornet that Christopher and Esmeralda succeeded myself and Shannon Morgan at 12th night. We had to get other people to fill their cars to bring stuff home. I had a a pavilion. I got a sword. We got cloaks. We got bolts of fabric. We got our arms and marzipan. We got, just lots of stuff. And that sort of thing was happening. And so part of what occurred was the groundswell of kind of organized material that the king was beginning to create kind of trickled up to the crown. That sense of obligation, it wasn't anymore, wait, people gave me a pavilion, so I can't just show up at the next event in my little tent.
Were they hinting at you?
I got to pitch that pavilion. No, this was before people had pavilions.
Oh.
Yeah, it was just out of the kindness of their heart.
Oh.
Right.
But it's like getting the sweater from grandma at Christmas. The next time you're there, you better be wearing that sweater.
So true.
So that a lot of it was a almost perpetuating mechanism of individual moments of impetus across the broad swath of participation, and that created an environment of kind of material obligation and commitment to be worthy of all that stuff. And so by the mid 80s, when you look at a lot of the Torfin's reigns, Fabian's reigns, and the early Jade reigns, and these things were productions.
Yeah.
Thousands and thousands of dollars and many hours and resources went into these reigns. And it kind of created this juggernaut that was some of the first practical moments where the question of do I enter a crown to win the crown was a question just beyond ego.
So it's funny you should bring that up, because I think that there was sort of like this kind of tipping point that you're talking about, where that expectation soared so high that the cost to entry for reigning was pretty significant. And I think that in that time there was almost like an underground movement, if you will, that promoted the notion of, no, you don't have to spend thousands of dollars on garb alone for a reign. There are ways in which, especially with the help of travel funds and those that are willing to give it their time and effort to enhance the reign.
No.
I was just saying that there came a point where reigns were so expensive and such big productions that there was sort of an underground movement to bring them back into the realm of affordability. Right. One of the things that the West and even the Mists and all the principalities in the kingdom really prided ourselves on was open and robust royal tournaments, right? And that was extraordinarily important. Cost to entry had to be addressed, and I'm glad that there's been a scale back of that expectation. And it's nice when somebody can afford to make a big production out of it, but it's not the expectation as much as it used to be, say, back in the late 80s, early 90s.
I think it's about giving back, not
I'm guessing
necessarily how you dress. It's about giving back to your community and your principality or kingdom. So,
well, the idea was to celebrate the moment of context of enjoying something ideal, and that's not supposed to be costly.
Yeah, agreed.
And that being said,
you could have the medieval moment without a fat bank account.
Yeah. And maybe that being said, it's a great positive place to sort of end things for today. About it's a good thing to leave in everybody's brains. It's about what we're doing, not all the dollars that go into it, the heart that goes into it, and the joy that it brings us. And it's a good stopping place, and it's a good place to leave it in our hearts. But we're all here. We all play the same game, and our goals are ultimately the same. And so what is a part of Misty history is a part of the West Kingdom history, is a part of the society history. And that's what's important as we're capturing all these moments.
wasn't for a Misty history, the rest of this wouldn't have occurred.
Exactly.
Oh, yes.
And with that, I just want to say thank you to both of you again for taking time out of your day, sitting and chatting with Brion and I, and just telling us the most fabulous and fun things. So thank you both so much again.
Thank you
from
for
bottom
the
of my heart.
invitation.
Thanks. Yeah, this is I enjoyed it tremendously, and it was so good to see you, Hilary.
Yes.